It gives me very great pleasure indeed to introduce to you Professor Peter Tyler. Peter Tyler is a professor at St Mary's University in Twickenham in Strawberry Hill. Some of you probably remember many, many years ago that was a Catholic teacher training college. It's now a university in its own right, and Peter is the professor of spirituality there. He's a very dedicated follower of all things Carmelite, and in particular, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And he's written extensively about both of these great saints. I had the great pleasure of being with him on the pilgrimage that the Forum organised to Avila at the beginning of September, where he showed absolutely unrivaled knowledge of Teresa, of Avila itself, and the whole context of that wonderful period in Spanish history when John and Teresa lived. This morning he's going to talk to us about Teresa with the subtitle there, Daughter of Fire. So please welcome Professor Peter Tyler.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and it's a great honour and privilege to be here with you this morning, stroke afternoon. I think it's now afternoon. No. For those of you right at the back, it doesn't really matter if you can't see me. The most important thing is that you can see the slides, which are there. Well, we're almost there. It seems extraordinary to think that a year has gone so quickly that we were in Kensington with the Discalced Carmelites to begin this odyssey, this walk. I'm looking forward to getting my Saturdays back. I think I've been talking almost every Saturday this year, and I knew the final event was happening today, and I said to the organisers, you know, I'm coming anyway, so put me down on the washing up rota or moving the chairs or something. And they asked me to give this lecture. So I thought, well, do you really want me to give a lecture? Because probably they've heard everything I have to say, but here I am, so I hope you'll enjoy it. There's an old academic tradition that you never give the title of the paper that you're advertised to give. It's advertised as Teresa Today and Tomorrow. Actually, the title of my talk is Teresa of Avila, Daughter of Fire. But I think as I'm giving the talk, hopefully you will see how this relates to Teresa today, then, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And helpful in that respect was Sister Jo's excellent address that she gave just now. And I'd like to begin by just drawing. She noticed me taking notes while she was talking, which was a little bit anxious. But I'd like to just pick up three themes that she mentioned there, because they really highlight or counterpoint what I'm going to say. The first, and they're really, in my academic mind, three tensions that she picked up. The first tension she mentioned was this polarity between prayer and social change. And I think that's absolutely essential to make sense of what I'm going to talk about, which is Teresa's foundations. We've had talks this year on the Book of the Life, the Way of Perfection, the Interior Castle, but I thought I would concentrate at this final talk on the Book of Foundations. And that dynamic that Sister Jo pointed out between prayer and change is absolutely at the heart of what Teresa is about and the heart of her message for us today. I was working through yesterday a dissertation proposal for a student on Thomas Merton, whose celebration we also have this year. I was also reading the beautiful new edition of Mount Carmel magazine that just arrived yesterday with a wonderful little essay by Dr. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And in that article, Rowan Williams makes that connection between Thomas Merton and Teresa of Avila. And of course, Thomas Merton's back in the news, if he ever went out in the news, after the Pope referenced him in his talk to Congress last month. And in one of his last letters, Thomas Merton poses the question about the future of monasticism, monastic life, religious life in general. He says, is it about survival or prophecy? Is it about survival or prophecy? I think we get so caught up with survival, keeping, this is a wonderful building, but the upkeep of it is unimaginable, and I hope you'll all give generously to the friars when you leave today. But because we have to keep these places going, sometimes we concentrate too much on survival, which is important, of course. But I think what we get from the Book of the Foundations is the role of Teresa as prophet, and that's one of the elements I want to concentrate on. The second element, Sister Jo pointed out, was the relationship between the person and the world. In our world, I would say, between the individual and the state. On the way here this morning, we spent a lot of time talking about the horrendous events in the Middle East that seems like the prelude to the Third World War, the bombing of Syria by America and Russia, what looks like a new intifada in Jerusalem, and ISIL and so on and so forth. And I think faced with this barrage of media coverage of these horrendous events, we feel useless, we feel disempowered. And again, I think one of the lessons we get from Teresa is the power of the person, the power of the individual against these crushing state forces. And again, this is one of the other dimensions in her life. The third is the one which Sister Jo called the church matters, and the tension within the church. I used to live in a community called L'Arche, founded by, not far from here in Kent, by a French-Canadian, Jean Vanier. And Jean Vanier himself had problems with the church authorities before the Second Vatican Council. And he wrote a wonderful, inspiring letter to a friend of mine. And in that letter, he said it was God's infinite wisdom when the church was founded to raise up two groups within the church. One group had to hold on to the original vision in all its beauty and glory and pass it on from generation to generation. The second group had to adapt that vision and make it relevant for each succeeding generation with all their challenges and problems. And he said, it's God's infinite wisdom that each group will make life hell for the other. And I'm glad you laughed at that. So there's a tension within the church, and that's a necessary tension. We're seeing it played out before our eyes in Rome today during the synod that's taking place. And I ask you during this day that we hold those three together. Those three things, the power of prayer, the role of the individual, and the church. And also in our prayers and our Mass later on, we hold all those world events, because we're called out to this beautiful place to listen to these inspiring words and meet friends and make new friends. But then we have to go back out. We have to go back out to a world that Teresa called a world in flames. And that's really where I want to start. The reason why I chose this title, Daughter of Fire, and here you see her in her little chariot, her wagon, going around the towns of Spain, founding her convents. And she says, there's one of her sayings is, La vida es una noche en mala posada. Life is like a night in a bad inn. And she knew a lot of nights in bad inns, so she knew what she was talking about. But over this Theresian year, when I was asked to give this talk today, reflecting on it, and especially visiting Avila, been twice now this year, what occurred to me is, well, what confronted me is what Sister Jo will now show us, quite a lot of this sort of thing. It's the what I call the cuddly Teresa. You know, I mean, God bless her. I mean, the Spanish economy is in a very bad way, so who can blame them? You know, they've really milked this anniversary. Places, we were a bit shocked with the pilgrimage, places that we normally go to that are free, they'd hiked the charges up twice or 3 times, and who can blame them? You know, they need all the help they can get, and they're not going to get this again for another 500 years. But I think what this highlights is this tendency to domesticate Teresa. I went to a big academic conference in Spain, and you'd have thought, you know, everyone loved Teresa, and isn't she wonderful, and everything she did was fantastic, and King Philip, I thought it was the cause for the canonization of King Philip II of Spain at the end of the conference. But the reality is what I call the more spiky Teresa. I mean, Teresa was not generally loved by a lot of people. She caused a lot of trouble for a lot of people. And she really did roll her sleeves up and get involved with some of the deepest political and social divisions of her time. And that's really what I want to concentrate on during this talk. So I'm not going to be an iconoclast. I don't want to destroy our ideas of Teresa, but I would be grateful to get rid of that picture, and perhaps if we could replace it with something a little more like Rubens' rather wonderful picture. This was painted not long after her canonization. Rubens would have known people who knew Teresa, because by that stage the sisters had reached the Low Countries. And of all the paintings of Teresa, this isn't an art history lecture, but of all the paintings of Teresa, this, I find, is one of the most perspicacious. And it shows something of the older Teresa, the more mature Teresa, the wiser Teresa. I asked for it to go on the front cover of my last book on Teresa, and the publishers refused. They thought it looked a bit too solemn and forbidding, which was a bit of a shame. But I think that, yeah, let's take her seriously. Let's take her seriously as a woman, as a doctor of the church, and, dare I say it, as a politician, someone who was able, as Sister Jo said, to find God amongst the pots and pans. All that rubbish that we have to deal with on a daily basis, all the politics, the backbiting, the hypocrisies, all that rubbish that we, of course it doesn't refer to any of the communities of anyone here, but in all the other communities we know. And Teresa was able to find God even in that, and I think that is remarkable. Teresa, when she wrote the Book of the Foundations, she began about 1565, 1566, was in her 50th year. And she'd sensed, in a way, when she began that book, a change in the air. Whereas her earlier text, The Way of the Life, had been largely retrospectively, the new books that she was writing at this time, The Way of Perfection and the Book of the Foundations, I mean, literally the Camino, they were ways for the future. She was writing them as she went, and she was mapping out ways to the future. The Way of Perfection maps these paths through ethical desire, ascetic practice, and ultimately the famous extended metaphor on the Lord's Prayer. The Book of the Foundations charts this Camino through a more exoteric geography, full of the pitfalls of doubting companions, unreliable roads, the wiles of the devil, and the perpetually adverse Spanish climate. Teresa describes herself in this book as una romera, a word that we can variously translate as a gadabout, a pilgrim, a wanderer, or a restless one. Both of the routes laid out in the Way of way of perfection, the foundations, begin with a call articulated at the outset. In the way, as we've already mentioned this morning, it is a response to the world set on fire. In the case of the foundations, it is the visit she describes to San Jose of a Franciscan friar, Frau Alonso Maldonado, who had recently returned from the King's dominions in South America. Teresa, of course, and her foundations were intimately linked to this discovery of the new world. I read in the paper this morning that, I don't know if anyone here will join it, that they're now planning a colony on the moon, which is going to start in the next few years, as well as our exploration of Mars. And again, as we heard a couple of weeks ago, now they've discovered water on the surface of Mars. It makes it much more likely that we will be able to send people there. And our relationship to these planets and the moon is very much not too dissimilar to these people's relationship with the new world. Going to Patagonia or Ecuador at that time would be like going to the moon or Mars today. A very uncertain enterprise, take a lot of money, unclear of the outcome. And yet 5 of Teresa's brothers set off on that journey. 5 of them were conquistadores. So she was very linked with what was going on in this new world. And she described herself, when she heard from Frau Maldonado's report, as so grief-stricken over the loss of so many souls that I cannot contain myself. And she goes on, I went to a hermitage with many tears and cried out to the Lord that he may give me the means to be able to do something to win some souls to his service. I often think of the little Teresa of Lisieux, who, as we know, famously wanted to go on the missions and felt herself, like big Teresa, compelled to follow that path. Teresa, as we know, lived in a time of great upheaval and of reform. Again, one of the lessons I think we can take from this 500th year anniversary is the similarity between Teresa's time and our own. We have our internet, our iPods, and I hope they're all switched off at the moment, our emails. For Teresa's generation, the printed book and the pamphlet was the internet of the day. This was the new, hottest technology, and it would create such a change in European understanding, self-understanding. I was talking with a student a couple of days ago about the new technologies, and they were saying, well, we can learn quickly from each other. I said, well, remember, in Teresa's time, the new technologies, the printed books, would have had the same effect on ordinary people's learning. And of course, Teresa benefited from this as a young woman when she was trying to find her way in prayer, and she was able to access those printed books. The other thing that we've already highlighted this morning is that the ancient institution of the medieval church was now being challenged by the new ideas of the Reformation and Renaissance spreading throughout Europe. And as we shall see, and what is important in our understanding of Teresa, is that she is a reformer. She's every much as bitter a reformer as Luther or Calvin. And, she may have used slightly different methods from Luther and Calvin, but I think that the spirit of Teresa, this reform and this Renaissance spirit, is absolutely essential to our understanding of her. And as I say, we have this discovery of the new world and all that is going to open up. So the Book of the Foundations takes place, or it's enacted against this technological, spiritual and cultural upheaval with which Teresa has to engage. It's also, as we said, an inward journey of discovery. If we could have the next picture. After his general visitation to Teresa's new foundation at San Jose in 1567, the Carmelite general Giovanni Battista Rossi, known in Spanish as Rubio, as Teresa says in her Book of Foundations, chapter 2, she writes, "He was delighted to see our manner of life, and with it a picture, no matter how imperfect, of the beginnings of our order, and how the primitive rule was observed in all its rigour. For in the whole of the order," so she says, "it wasn't observed, only in mitigation." I have to be careful what I say, because I know I'm in the house of the what we call nowadays the classic Carmelites. That's what Father Kevin calls them. The result of this visitation was perhaps greater than Teresa could have hoped for. He granted her extensive patent letters, quote, "so that more monasteries could be founded along with censures to prevent any provincial from restraining me." The first letter allowed the foundation of new houses of no more than 25 nuns each under the jurisdiction of the order, while the second limited the foundations to new and old Castile. The latter stipulation, as we shall see, would later cause Teresa many problems as the order spread throughout Spain and she encountered what she called her difficult Andalusians. Again, another nice thing about Teresa is she has her foibles, she has her prejudices. She doesn't like southern Spanish people, the Andalusians. She says some, frankly, quite racist things about them. But again, I think the warts and all make her come more alive as a human being. The nuns, it was decided would follow the first rule of the original Carmel. That's in inverted commas. There's a whole lot of scholarly talk about this, and to be honest, if you want to know more about that, we might perhaps cover it in the questions this afternoon. I'm not going to go into it now. And they would wear the coarse habits of grey cloth. Later, she tells us in the Foundations, Rossi would write to her, urging her to found, and this is a famous quote, quote, "as many convents as there were hairs on her head." The final act of Rossi before he left Spain was to give her a letter patent for the foundation of 2 priories of Descalced friars. This was given at Barcelona in 1567. As was often the case in Teresa's life, the outward change of her desire for reform was accompanied also by an inward change. And it is clear that at this time her spiritual life was moving into a new, more silent interiority, what she would call recollection or oración mental, probably closer to what we would nowadays call mindfulness or heartfulness. But after this interiority, this stillness, to use a phrase of an American writer, Jack Cornfield, after the ecstasy comes the laundry. After the ecstasies described in the Book of the Life, Teresa realized that she had to get on with things. She had to go out there. One interesting thing when I wrote my book on Teresa was, one thing I wanted to do was to see her reception by the British. And what is fascinating about Teresa is the British take her to her heart very early on. One of the first translations into another language is into English. And it's as though this practical pots and pans side of Teresa does appeal to the British characters. We resonate with that. She was clearly so excited by what had happened to her in her prayer life, how her life had been completely turned upside down by the love of God, that she wanted everyone to have this experience. Not only that, she appreciated that in the Spain of her time there was a hunger for this sort of experience, as there is today. I mean, people talk about the lack of the fall of the church, but there's no doubt that there is this great hunger for spiritual things in our society today. And she became convinced that she had the unique gifts to enable this to happen. While she was founding the original convent of San Jose in Avila, as described in the Life, she did not seem to identify herself as a mother foundress. Rather, the idea seemed to have arisen from conversations with a group of like-minded spirits, religious and lay, where Teresa acted as the prima inter pares, the first among equals, the spokesperson or chair of a reforming committee. Yet as we read in the Book of the Foundations, we share with Teresa her growing realization of her own vocation as someone who must bring the opportunity for quiet contemplative prayer to the turbulent society of her time. This was her crusade. As her brothers were out conquistadoring in the New World, she was engaging in her own crusade, her own conquistadores. And this was against the background of this Europe in flames. Teresa herself seems to have had very little idea of the main subtle theological points upon which the manifesto of the Reformation was being fought. What she did understand, however, very clearly, and of this she was very fierce and fiery about, was the need for reform in a church sadly weakened over the past few decades. And as we find in her writing, Teresa was a true original. She offered a path for her contemporaries between, on the one side, fundamentalist iconoclasm, such as she heard stories of in Northern Europe, and on the other side, the reaction of the inquisitorial suspicion. And again, as Sister Jo pointed out, she loves the church. She doesn't want to destroy the church, but she wants to get that balance back into how we do things, a bit like Jean Vanier was saying earlier. And in this book, the Book of the Foundations, we hear the voice of a sometimes lonely woman trying to walk that precarious path of liberation on behalf of her sisters and brothers in Christ. If we could have the next quote. For Teresa, central to her reform was the belief that every baptized Christian, I can't emphasize this enough, every baptized Christian has the right of access to the contemplative life. When many of us were younger, and I still encounter this a lot, the works of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross and so on were sort of out of bounds. It was considered a little bit of bad taste, really, to be involved in contemplative prayer. Teresa is convinced that as baptized Christian, the contemplative life is our birthright. And in this respect, she was, of course, returning to the original Carmelite vision. She writes, this is in the interior castle, all of us who wear this sacred habit of Carmel are called to prayer and contemplation, because that was our origin. That is, we are descended from those holy fathers of ours of Mount Carmel, who in such great solitude and with such contempt of the world sought this treasure, this precious pearl of which we speak. And we're literally sitting now in the shrine created by those original fathers of Carmel, who literally came from Carmel here to Kent. The aim of her reform then was to recreate, or perhaps better, create the conditions where at first her daughters and later her sons could cultivate this special pearl of great price. Just a little word about the book. Unlike The Way of Perfection, written rapidly after the life, and the later Interior Castle, the Foundations were written piecemeal as she went through Spain and did her foundations. You just see there's the list of all the foundations in her life, starting with Medina del Campo at the top, and a final one with Burgos at the bottom. And as she went through Spain, and I think we've got a map. Yes, we've got a map of Spain. So you've got a sense there of the terrain of Spain. Remember, Spain is one of the most mountainous countries in Europe. and she would transverse these places. I mean, how she got around is quite remarkable, up and down. We'll just have the wagon again. Next picture. This is her mode of transport, this funny little covered wagon. There's many amusing stories. Another beautiful thing, of course, about Teresa is she could talk on equal terms with kings, King Philip, with cardinals, and also she got on very well with the mule drivers. Apparently she would always have a kind word for them, and they absolutely loved her. You know, they would do anything for her. Here's a slightly older lithograph, the next picture. These are all the foundations in a slightly older picture. According to the prologue to the foundations, she began the work in Salamanca in August 1573, 11 years after the life was written. This was after the suggestion of a Jesuit confessor, who had been so edified after reading the life. However, according to a testimony written by Teresa in Malagon around 1570, the origin of the book had a divine mandate. And if we, next slide, see that. Having seen a vision of the wounded Christ after communion, so the state relates in her spiritual testimonies, Christ turned to her and said that I shouldn't grieve over those wounds, but over the many that were now being inflicted upon him. I asked him what I could do as a remedy for this, because I was determined to do everything I could. He told me that now was not the time for rest, but that I should hurry to establish these houses, and that he would find rest for the souls that would live there, and that I must take all the houses that might be given to me, because there were many souls who could not serve him, because they had no place in which they could do so. That the houses I founded in small towns should be just like this one, and that I should write about the foundations of these houses. According to the testimony, she felt unable to write. But rather than being a hindrance, she felt that the Lord was taking her into a place of unknowing, exactly where she needed to be to start the narrative. I thought, she says, of how with regard to the house in Medina, I never understood anything of how I could write of this foundation. The work on the text would consequently proceed in fits and starts as she continued writing. And one of the interesting things of the Book of Foundations is it contains some of the last writing that she ever did before she died. And in a way, the book itself, and by the way, the aim of this talk today is not for you to listen to Peter Tyler or read my stuff. At the end of today, I hope you'll go home and dust off your copy of the Book of Foundations and read her writings, because she is the master. And the book itself, I think, is her answer to the question, how does God act in the world? And her answer to this question is very simple. Look around you. Look at his workings in bringing these convents into the world. In contrast to her other books, The Way of Perfection, The Interior Castle, the Book of the Foundations had another inbuilt problem. She tells us in the prologue that the account will be given in all truthfulness, in conformity with what has taken place. Well, that's a problem, because many of the people and incidents, some of them difficult and controversial as anything so far in her life, were still alive, and some of these problems were still around. So when she's writing the Book of the Foundations, which makes it such a delight to read, it's also the one of her books that contains the most humour. Have a look, next one. And there's some wonderful little vignettes in her book. This is the famous story in Medina del Campo. What had happened there? Two of the sisters, of course, isn't it wonderful to promote contemplative prayer? But the Inquisition had a beady eye on these sort of movements because of this thing that was called alumbradismo, Illuminati. And two of the sisters in Medina del Campo claimed that they could only live on the host. They didn't need worldly food. As long as they had the host and some water, I presume, they could continue to live. Well, all very well, but this is exactly the sort of thing the Inquisition could get very touchy about. And in fact, this is the sort of thing that could lead to either Teresa or her sisters being burnt at the stake. And she writes, I started to talk to the nuns and to give them many reasons, sufficient in my opinion, to prove to them that the idea that they would die without this particular help was pure imagination. This is the practical Teresa. But the notion was so deeply rooted in their minds that no argument could eradicate it. It was useless to reason with them further. So, seeing that it was in vain, I told them that I had those very desires myself, and yet I should stay away from communion, so that they might realize that they ought not to communicate except when all the nuns did so together. And so we would all three die together. You know, it's wonderful, we can laugh, but this could have been a very, very serious situation. And throughout the book of the Foundations, she uses humour to sort of diffuse some of these problems. We have the next slide. The other thing that comes across clearly around the Foundations is that Teresa was very practical. One of the sisters after her death recalled, in those early days, there were no lay sisters, and we each took a week at a time in the kitchen. Despite all her numerous occupations, the Holy Mother would take her week like the other sisters, and it gave us no small happiness to see her in the kitchen, for she worked very gaily, and she took great care to look after us, for I bet she was very good at washing the dishes, I have no doubt about that. While she was in Medina, founding that convent, you have the next picture, the next and probably the most significant event happened, her meeting with the young friar, Juan de San Matia. This is a typical painting of the two of them, and it's completely erroneous and misleading. They've got the heights about right. Teresa at this point had earmarked two friars, Friar Antonio and Friar Juan, and she called them her friar and a half. We're not sure whether she was referring to the size of John of the Cross or the fact that Friar Antonio was half a friar, but anyway. For the feminists among you, this is a nice sort of proof text as feminist, whatever. Teresa at this point was twice the age of John. She was probably more like the Rubens picture we saw earlier. The artist depicts her as a very young woman, and John looks about 68 there, doesn't he? I mean, the poor guy, he died at 49, so I don't think he ever looked so old. So again, we've got a sort of feminist subtext here, how Teresa is always being portrayed as this young, virginal, innocent, and John is the real brains behind the operation, whereas in fact the reality was quite different. Calling him my novice, she undertook to start the first male reform. This took place in a place called Durejo, which is a small, out-of-way place, still a very deserted place. And she gives a beautiful description of the book of the Foundations of this. This is, of course, like all the discalced houses, such as in Kensington today. The choir was in the garret. The centre part was sufficiently lofty to enable them to say the hours, but they had to stoop a great deal to get in far enough to hear Mass. In the two corners nearest the church, they had two small hermitages, full of hay. The place is very cold, a bit like today, in which there was only room for them to lie prostrate or be seated, for the roof was almost on their heads. I knew that from the end of Matins until the prime, they did not retire to their cells, but remained there in prayer. For their prayer was so deep that it sometimes happened to them to go to prime with a considerable quantity of snow on their habits and not to feel it. There you are, brothers, there's an inspiration. From here, and again, this is where the political sense of Teresa comes in, she starts Foundations in Toledo and Pastrana. Why Toledo and Pastrana? Teresa, at the beginning of her reform had allied her, and I've only just discovered this year as part of our academic conferences. We had a paper earlier on in Oxford, and it will be published next year, on Teresa and these great families in Spain. And in Spain at this time, there were two big families, the Mendozas and the Albas, and there was a big rivalry between them. At the beginning of her foundation, she allies herself with the Mendozas, interestingly enough, another converso family like hers. And they were behind the earlier foundation in Malagon, for example. By the time she gets to Pastrana, she changes her allegiance. The Mendozas are falling out of fashion with the king. She's not stupid. She shifts her alliance over to the Albas. And of course, the Duchess of Alba will feature quite a lot in her the later foundations. And of course, the famous Princess of Eboli, also related to the Albas. So Teresa's got, subtle political antennae. She can spot these things. I think if we put the picture up, it's that picture again. You can see the Pastrana and the Toledo foundations. Once she was engaged in this, strange news came back. She was asked to be prioress of the Encarnacion again. Silverio, famous historian, accepts the account of Maria Pinel, the 17th century chronicler of the history of the Encarnacion, that the appointment of Teresa at the Encarnacion was a trick of the Carmelite provincial, who was motivated by the fact that the nuns of the Encarnacion had not accepted his own candidate as prioress, and his desire to prevent Teresa from founding any new convents. That's what they say, anyway. But despite this, as we know so well, Teresa wooed the sister at the Encarnacion and was able to soothe some of those rivalries and bring more harmony to the convent. Rossi, as we've heard, initially the Carmelite general gave a lot of support to Teresa's reform. After the foundation of the house at Medina, he wrote, "Teresa profits the order more than all the friars in Spain." However, as the need for reform for the universal church following the Council of Trent and the Northern Protestant Reformation was being felt across the continent, King Philip, who now enters the picture, also felt the need to be involved in the reform of the three orders. As I say, in Spain, I hope I'm not going to offend anyone here. There you are. Why change the habit of a lifetime? In Spain, if you listen to Philip's involvement with all this, you'd think he's on the road to canonization. The reality was he was a sort of meddling, slightly obsessive-compulsive, power freak. I mean, he at this point wanted to take over control of the reform of the Mercedarians, the Trinitarians, and the Carmelites. And it was only after a great deal of toing and froing with Rome that Philip agreed in July 1564 to promulgate the Tridentine decrees, allowing these orders to reform themselves. However, as Rossi set out to oversee this reform, Philip obtained from the new Pope Pius V what he had wanted: the right to oversee the reform through the appointment of ordinaries, ultimately responsible only to himself. And this, in a way, is where poor old John and Teresa suffered. They were the victims of this power politics between Philip on the one hand and Rome on the other. It got so bad at one point that Philip proposed dissolving the whole of the Carmelite order in Spain and handing over its houses to more compliant orders. And in 1571, the two newly appointed papal apostolic visitors, Pedro Fernandez for Castile and Francisco de Bagaz for Andalusia, had taken up their posts and were undergoing visitations, much to the chagrin of Philip. Into this already very delicate situation, And I hope you're getting the sense we're talking about a time of big characters. You know, this is a time of big people, not big egos, but big characters, slightly larger than life. And at this point comes the next character in our little drama, Geronimo Gracian, whose anniversary we celebrated last year. Born in Valladolid into a large family who had served the court faithfully, he studied at the new university in Alcalá, where he was ordained priest in 1570. Although initially interested in joining the Jesuits, he became enamoured of the Discalced life while staying at the newly established house in Pastrana, which was set up to serve the university there. Of these early reformers, Gracian, from the beginning, treated the reform as not being necessarily conjoined to the wider Carmelite body, but worked more avidly for its separation as a distinct entity. Rossi was unimpressed by Gracian. He wrote to him, now the next quote, he wrote to him, "You're scarcely a novice. Without knowledge of the institutes of the order, you may easily be led along ways and paths that are not good. I believe actions take their goodness from circumstances, and that the intention is not enough. Your intention is according to God, but because you act against obedience, I think you are not acting in the service of God." This is a very, you want a large gin, wouldn't you, if you've got this letter? "I think you are not acting in the service of God. I am afraid that beneath the pretext of laudable zeal, there lie suspicions and contentions." So that was another polarity that poor old Teresa had to deal with. Gracian egging on all the time. Again, one of the lovely things about Teresa is her affection, spiritual love, really, for Gracian. For her, he could do no wrong. And so again, in her letters to him, you see that human side of Teresa. As Teresa moved to Seville in 1575 to begin her troubled foundation in that city, Rossi wrote 2 letters to her, one in October 1574 and one in January 1575, asking for clarification of these latest developments in Andalusia. As you recall, she wasn't given permission to found in Andalusia. He was unhappy that friars previously disciplined were now roaming abroad in the reform, and felt that the new Discalced houses in Andalusia had to be closed. Sadly, these letters did not reach Teresa until June 17th, by which time Rossi had convened a general chapter of the order in Italy in May 1575 to take action on the situation in Spain. This chapter took the silence of the reformers, unfortunately they hadn't received the letters, as an open act of defiance. They agreed to forbid all new foundations, ordered Teresa to, quote, rest in a convent of her choice, appointed a general visitor, Tostado, to oversee the reform of the order in Spain, and ordered the closure of the 3 Andalusian foundations made without approval. As Teresa put it in the foundations, the definitory gave me a command not merely to make no more foundations, but not to leave the house in which I chose to reside, which would then be for me a kind of prison. One of the consequences and one of the things that compounded the situation is that the former nuncio Ormaneto, who was a great friend and protector of Gracian, died suddenly in June 1577 at the young age of 35. His replacement was Filippo Sega, who had been prejudiced against the reform in Italy, although he would later soften his attitude. It's to him we can attribute one of the most famous descriptions of Teresa, given in 1578. A troublesome, restless, disobedient and stubborn female who under the guise of devotion invented bad doctrines, running around outside the cloister against the order of the Tridentine Council of Prelates, instructing like a teacher in defiance of what St. Paul taught, who ordered women not to teach. Capitalizing on the appointment, always gets a laugh, that one. Capitalizing on the appointment of a new nuncio, unfavourable to the reform, Tostada decreed no new foundations for the reform to be made, and that each discalced house should replace their discalced superior with their previous classic superiors. And yet the irony, and to finish off with all this, the irony is that Teresa, arriving in Toledo around 1576 under her house arrest, began her last great masterpiece, the interior castle, written in probably only 3 months. Poor old John had a far worse fate. He was, and now I am getting into dangerous ground. I was speaking to one of the fathers, I won't name who it was, and one of the fathers said that, one of the classic Carmelites fathers, the problem is John had got a bit radicalised. He needed a bit of re-education. But he was kidnapped by some of the classic fathers and taken to this little, the friary. It's no longer there in Toledo, it's now a car park. Most of the places associated with John the Cross in Spain are now car parks. But he was held in that little prison there. Teresa wrote to the king, "They are holding them prisoners in their monastery. They broke into the cells and took them and the papers they had. The whole place is highly scandalized that they should dare so much when the place is so near where your majesty is. It does not appear that they respect either justice or God." So if you go to next one, it's here. Or justice or God. "As to me, it grieves me greatly to see them in their hands. They have been longing for this for days. I should think them better off if they were with the Moors, but perhaps they would have more pity." Teresa, in that jail, if you like, in Toledo, writes the interior castle. John, in his prison, begins his writing career and writes some of the greatest poetry of Christianity. And I think that's possibly a good place to end, that wonderful sense of paradox, even in all this despair, this hatred, this bile, see how these Christians love one another, this calumnies. Even in this, God can triumph. I began the lecture by calling Teresa a daughter of fire. And my intended aim was, as I said, to dispel the myth of the cuddly Teresa. As I hope you've been able to see, Teresa was not only all too human, but had to struggle and extricate from difficult situations in order to promote the gentle peace, the recollection she felt was the birthright of every Christian, and indeed, I would say, every human being. Today, as a woman, in that day, as a woman in a male-dominated world, she had to use all the wiles and wits at her disposal to cajole and steer her nascent reform through the corridors of power of 16th century Spain. I hope this talk has helped to remind us that Teresa, exceptional as she was a very human person, reacting, living in her cell, to human situations of jealousy, envy, and power politics. As we know, and we've already heard it today, and this is my last slide, at her death, there was found the famous prayer of St. Teresa, that she could navigate all this and not only survive, like her co-worker John, but also produce some of the greatest works of contemplation ever written, is, I believe, truly remarkable. Thank you very much.